parents, individuals put their families at risk. I guess we all do that to a certain extent. I mean, if you put your life savings, your retirement plans in the stock market, we can see it take a dip and great losses be result from that. I know back during the days of the Depression, when the stock market crashed, I mean, you think about people that were tied up in that, taking their own lives because it was so devastating. And it's not wrong to prepare for the future and save money and plan. I think God expects us to plan and make plans and do that kind of stuff. But we don't need to have that be where we lay our trust and our hopes and our entire being. Verse 15, I guess part of the reason or part of the conclusion he's making here, he says, we go the way we came, naked and empty-handed. This is another disappointment from a worldly and materialistic standpoint. Nothing we acquire or accomplish from our labor under the sun can be taken with us. Over in the 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 6 through 8, it tells us that godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out. And having therefore food and raiment or clothing, with these let us be content. Then verse 16, he kind of emphasizes it again. He says, this also is a severe evil, that we shall go exactly as he came. And then he asks the question, what profit has he from his labor? So what profit is there from all of our labor if we can't take any of it with us when we go? He says all his days he eats in darkness and has much sorrow, sickness, and anger. But that's not the end of the matter. I wanted to look at that passage. I don't see it on there on the board, but I wanted to turn back to Psalms chapter 127. Read a few verses from it. In this passage, we can see there is some more rewarding labor, of course, that we can participate in. And this is that labor and the rewards when we're doing it with the Lord. This is Psalm 127, verses 1 through 2. It says, unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain who build it. Unless the Lord guards the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. It is vain for you to rise up early, to sit up late, to eat the bread of sorrows, for he gives his beloved sleep. So if you're laboring working along with the Lord or in conjunction with the Lord and His teachings, we can rest at night. We can enjoy the profits from our labors and not have some of the sorrows and the griefs that are accompanied with those who labor through this life without the Lord at their side or as their guide. Jesus, of course, taught this to us in His teachings in the New Testament. But before I get there, I guess I had this reason, number 6, for why we should not pursue wealth. At death, you lose it all. You can't take it with you. I missed that one. But then the verse 17 is where we kind of get to this rewarding labor. But then in Matthew chapter 6, where we're talking about Jesus, these are the true riches that will last. Matthew chapter 6, verse 20, Jesus Himself, He tells us not to lay up treasures on earth where thieves break through and steal and moths corrupt, but to lay up treasures in heaven. And then in Matthew 19, verse 21, this is the story of the rich young ruler. I think Chris alluded to this in his lesson this morning. He told that man, to go and sell what he has and give to the poor and then come and follow him. And we know that, he went away sad because he trusted too much in his riches and wasn't willing to give them up. So we don't need to let our physical blessings become more important to us than God and then Christ and the church. I guess that could be a lesson we should learn there, but I don't have it in the thing in the presentation. So I I think that's everything I have on those particular passages down through verse 17. Any comments or any points anybody wants to make out or bring up on those? If not, we'll move to the last three verses of chapter 5. This is kind of a little more optimistic and entitled, Money a More Excellent Way. Oh, I messed up and pulled my marker out of my Ecclesiastes chapter. All right, here we are. So verses 18 through 20 says, "Here is what I have seen. It is good and fitting for one to eat and drink and to enjoy the good of all his labor in which he toils under the sun all the days of his life which God gives him, for it is his heritage. As for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth and given him power to eat of it, to receive his heritage and rejoice in his labor, this is the gift of God. For he will not dwell unduly on the days of his life, because God keeps him busy with the joy of his heart." All right, so in these last three verses, we see about he's talking about the prophet of man who lives his life with God as both his mentor and his guide. And here in verse 18, it says, "It's good and fitting for man to eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor, all the days of his life, which God gives him." And it says it's his heritage. Thinking about this, Chris hit on this verse too, because I actually had it in here that back in Genesis chapter 4, what did he tell Cain after Cain had kind of disobeyed his directions regarding the offering that he was to bring? Chris mentioned it, read it in his lesson today. But God told Cain, he says, "If you do well, will you not be accepted?" And that's so true with us. If we do what's right, if we do what's good, God will accept us. But if we don't, sin lies at the door, and therefore punishment is a result of it. Verse 19. It tells us that to those whom God has given riches and wealth and the power to eat of it, to receive his heritage and rejoice in his labor, it tells us again that this is the gift of God. And we could spend a lot of time talking about the gifts of God. I noted James 1:17 where I think I marked it, but I know that verse. But every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, which comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. Jesus, of course, is God's greatest gift to man. And in fact, in Ephesians chapter 3, Paul, talking about his own preaching and teaching, he tells us there in verse 8 of Ephesians 3 that he was to preach to the Gentiles the unsearchable riches of Christ. Verse 20, he tells us he'll not dwell unduly. Now, I don't know about y'all, but I have no idea. Unduly is not a word I'm familiar with, so I looked it up. It actually means, I think in this text, excessively. This man will not live excessively. But God keeps him busy with the joy of his heart. And there's some different translations depending on what you read. The New International Version says he seldom reflects on the days of his life, and I assume that's reflecting in a kind of like a negative or sorrowful reflection, because this is the man who has joy in his heart and because of the blessings that he has and the blessings that he gets from God, living under his guidance. The Revised Standard Version says would not much remember. But so that kind of brings me down to the last point and reason for not pursuing wealth. It says the quest for riches is hard and bitter, and days are spent in tedious and vexing work. It's far better to get by with fewer things and less money and be able to enjoy life. I think I feel like sometimes I've done that. I know when Gail and I, when we first got married, we were fortunate enough that she didn't have to work too much out of the home when we had young kids, and that was a blessing to our kids. I think our kids are a lot better than they would be otherwise had we both been working and not have been able to spend them time with her, because she was an excellent influence on them. But unfortunately, in today's society, it's difficult for both parents to survive without them working out of the home. So I really feel for our younger parents that have children these days when they're having to seek child care and just to be able to support themselves financially. It's not easy. I know that most of us here are older and our kids are grown and almost gone anyway. But you know what I mean. The times have changed for us in this society. So, but there's blessings if we don't always have to have the best and the greatest. Try to worry about keeping up with the Joneses, as we've talked about before. But so if we can learn to live within our means, it will make our lives a lot more happier, and I think we can enjoy those times that we do have with our family members and those that we love. So. Wrapping up chapter 5, there's, I don't know why most of these, I have 7 lessons to learn from each of these chapters, but maybe not on all of them. The first one from chapter 5 is, do not be overly zealous in your religious endeavors. Number 2 is, oppression is a way of life where money is involved. And then number 3, it's the love of money which creates the problem. Money is not wrong in and of itself, but it's when we crave it too much or have an unhealthy desire for it. Number 4, wealth that is hoarded does harm to its owner. Number 5, you can't take your wealth with you to the next world. Number 6, wealth and possessions and the ability to enjoy them are a gift from God. And then last, number 7, God is the one who keeps us occupied with gladness of heart. All right, so that wraps up chapter 5. Any comments? Any additions anybody wants to throw out for Gail?
Didn't get as nice one or had to work for it, they don't appreciate it as much.
Right, so Gail's talking about the appreciation that comes with the things in this life, and how that, a lot of times our children, if they're given things on on a silver platter, so to speak, they may not appreciate it as much as if they had to work for it themselves to obtain it. They don't understand the sacrifices and the costs, the labors that go into acquiring that. And I agree. I think that's true for all of us. I know when I have to work hard for something, I appreciate it more, and I take better care of it too as a result of that. And easy come, easy go is right. That's right. Easy come, easy go. So it makes a difference, and not everybody is the same. Some children, some individuals are more appreciative and just have a greater respect of things, even if they are given to them, than others. Some of them maybe need to take some lessons in that regard, but it can vary. You can see that pendulum sweep from one side to the other, depending on the individual and their disposition and how they respond. So and as parents, I think it may be part of our responsibility to realize that and try to help them to learn. If they're not very appreciative and not very inclined to taking care of the things, maybe we need to make them struggle a little bit more so they'll learn. I know between my two, I only had 2 children. I had a boy first and then a girl. And Our boy was an angel. He was a lot like my wife. Just he followed the rules of the road, so to speak. And then my daughter, she was kind of more like me, who would try to see how far over in the ditch she could get from one side to the other, you would think sometimes. But it's funny how God blesses your children with different dispositions and personalities. Anyway, anybody other comments? I need to get moving on chapter 6, I guess. So let's move on to chapter 6. We'll read the first 6 verses. So there is an evil which I've seen under the sun, and it is common among men, a man to whom whom God has given riches and wealth and honor, so that he lacks nothing for himself of all he desires. Yet God does not give him power to eat of it, but a foreigner consumes it. This is vanity and an evil affliction. If a man begets 100 children and lives many years, so that the days of his years are many, but his soul is not satisfied with goodness, or indeed he has no burial, I say that a stillborn child is better than he. For it comes in vanity and departs in darkness, and its name is covered with darkness. Though it has not seen the sun or known anything, this has more rest than that man. Even if he lives 1,000 years twice, but has not seen goodness, do not all go to one place. This particular passage is entitled The Unfulfilled Life. Here in verses 1 through 6, we see a person who has money but has derived no real joy from his privileges and is pretty much just a pitiful wretch. His money serves no purpose but to be passed on to others. Here we find that Ecclesiastes again wants us to see that because life is short, it should be enjoyed. A life spent huddled over work or eaten away by anxieties is wasted. Here in verse 1, we're told that this situation is another evil found under the sun, one which, and it's a common evil, one which can be encountered during our vain lives in this world. It's described as a common evil or one which weighs heavily upon man. Koheleth here in this particular passage in verse 2 is telling us that it's a man who lacks nothing of his own desires. God's given him wealth, possession, and honors, yet God does not give him the power or ability to enjoy them. Even worse, a stranger or foreigner, is given the opportunity and pleasure of enjoying them instead. And he says that this is a vanity and an evil affliction. It clearly isn't right for everything that you've worked for to be, end up given to somebody else and you not being able to take it, have the opportunity to enjoy it. It is a sore affliction. And it happens, I guess, in some in this life. Not everybody's, I think about the story of it's not the rich young ruler, but it's the rich man who was going to tear down his barn and build bigger, and then ended up, he didn't realize that night his soul was going to be required of God, and so he didn't have the opportunity to enjoy the things that he had planned for and hoped for, and we never know, which day will be our last. This verse 3, this kind of takes a dark turn here these next few verses. He says, this verse seems to be for emphasis, includes what appears to be a hypothetical illustration for making a more dramatical point. The man in verse 2 is typical and has the standard measures of prosperity in with his wealth and possessions. However, this verse 3, goes beyond the typical and references a man blessed with many years and hundreds of children, a long life with great posterity. It could have been a ruralistic person back in the Old Testament in those days when they lived to be, 500 or 600 years old, I guess, or even if it had been someone who had, multiple wives for being able to bear children to them. But this is kind of non-typical. However, even having all these blessings from such a large family is still no good if a person is unable to enjoy them. And then the second part of verse 3 is where it kind of shocks us. This verse uses the example of a stillborn child for rhetorical purposes, to make the point that life without joy, no matter how rich a person may be, is wasted. This text should not be used for attempting to discern what happens to the souls of stillborn children. He tells us in verse 4 that the stillborn comes in vanity and goes in darkness, and its name is covered in darkness. Even though the stillborn has not seen the sun or known anything, it is better off than the man who has no enjoyment or who has known no goodness in his life. I think a couple other little points on verse 6. He goes on for even greater emphasis. He says, should a man live 1,000 years twice and still not have any goodness, it is vanity. And then he kind of winds it up by saying, do not all go to one place. This, of course, being another reference to the eventual physical death that we all must face, the grave, and eventually all returning to the dust from which we came. So, some pretty dramatic examples there about emphasizing that we need to try to enjoy the blessings that God has given us in this life while we're here. Don't get so wrapped up in trying to earn more or live beyond our means. Take time to enjoy it because life is short. I guess I'm fixing to be hitting 60, so I'm getting close to the last quarter of my life. And I look back and I think, wow, it has flown by. Since after we had children, those last 40 years, they have really gone by, and it does get faster. I guess some of you could probably testify. It seems like it gets faster. The older you get, the faster it goes. So I think most of us being here today, obviously we are concerned about the future and this life to come, or we wouldn't be here preparing for it. So good for us. So we need to stay on that path and keep firm, and keep doing, I guess, what we're doing, and put our trust in God that He'll bless us when our time does come. Any thoughts or comments on these first 6 verses? I guess this chapter is kind of broken up into two sections of 6 verses. I don't really have anything else to say on those verses. So, y'all have any thoughts? Some of these I don't have answers for. I'm just going to throw them out there. When we get into this section, there's a lot of questions I can't answer for you. So, Ron. Oh, I know. So Ron's pointing out that. Right. I mean, Ron points out that here in our country, for the most of us probably in this audience, we've had a pretty good life. We haven't had any real sore afflictions, haven't been persecuted, haven't been having to endure a devastating war in our home, in our nation here in where we live physically, like over in the Ukraine and some of those, that would be very disrupting, very devastating to our lives. Back in chapter 3 where he talks about all those being a time and a season for everything under the sun. War was one of those. There's a time for war and there's a time for peace. Unfortunately, I'm sure those people over there, they didn't ask for that war. They didn't want it. Nobody would when it comes. But, all you can do is try to, struggle through it, make the most of it. We don't know what kind of a hand God's going to deal out to us in this life, and We may think tomorrow's going to be just like today, but something could happen today and our life be changed just like that. We just never know what's on the brink. So, any other thoughts? All right, well, we'll just move on to the next section. Like I said, this is unanswered questions is the title of this one. This is the remainder of chapter 6, I think. Yeah, we're going to read 7 through 12. All the labor of man is for his mouth, and yet the soul is not satisfied. For what more has the wise man than the fool? What does the poor man have? Who knows how to walk before the living? Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of desire. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. Whatever one is, he has been named already. For it is known that he is man, and he cannot contend with him who is mightier than he. Since there are many things that increase vanity, how is man the better? For who knows what is good for man in life, all the days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow? Who can tell what will happen after him under the sun? So if I'm not mistaken, there's 6 unanswered questions in these 6 passages that we're presented with. The first 3 verses, though, also, this is verse 7 through 9, they contain 2 proverbs, and this section of Scripture here kind of makes a transition from a major discussion of wealth that started back in verse 10 of chapter 5 and goes through verse 6 of this chapter. He's transitioning from the discussion of wealth to a major discussion of wisdom and death, which we'll pick up here in verse 10 and go through into the first few chapters, first few verses of chapter 7. Verse 7, he tells us this first proverb given to us in this verse teaches us that appetite is the thing that drives us, but is never satisfied. And appetite is a Hebrew word called nephesh, N-E-P-H-E-S-H. It refers to also, or it's translated in some places as the soul or the throat also. Here it's referred to as an appetite. I think I marked Proverbs 13. Proverbs 13 verses 2 through 4. I wanted to read that because here in verse 2 there, where it refers to the soul, I think that's the same word. This is Proverbs 13, 2 through 4. A man shall eat well by the fruit of his mouth, but the soul of the unfaithful feeds on violence. He who guards his mouth preserves his life, but he who opens wide his lips shall have destruction. The soul of a lazy man desires and has nothing, but the soul of the diligent shall be made rich. So I guess the point here being in that verse where he refers to the soul, that's the same Greek word that's used here referring to the appetite. And I guess the point is, all men work to eat for the strength to go on working that we may go on eating. And even if he enjoys his work and his food, the compulsion is still there. And it seems that his mouth, not his mind, seems to be the master. Verse 8, the first unanswered question presented here is, what more has the wise man than the fool? Back in chapter 2, we found that wisdom is better than folly. But here in this chapter, we're presented with the question of whether the wise man is actually better off than the fool. Materially, he may or may not be, but surely our own reasoning would conclude that he deserves to be. Certainly a wise man deserve to be materially better off than a fool. But then the second question is, what does the poor man have? These verses convey to us that wisdom cannot save us from our appetite or from poverty. And we've already seen that that previously in this book that death's going to lay both the wise man and the fool at the same level at death. With complete indifference. It doesn't matter whether you're wise and rich or whether you're foolish and poor. Death comes to all the same. Also in verse 8, we have another question given to us. Who knows how to walk before the living? This phrase may imply either a morally or socially well-conducted life. And the word for poor here in this verse is the same one that's used elsewhere to indicate one marked as downtrodden or sorrowful, one who looks to God for help. It's that poor in spirit man in Matthew chapter 5, as Jesus talks about in the Beatitudes. Whatever the intended meaning of walking among the living, it is important that we be satisfied with what we have. Back in chapter 5, verse 1, he tells us to walk prudently when we come to the house of God. But the context here in chapter 6 is about being content or satisfied with the things that we have. So walking contently. That goes back to that passage we quoted a while ago from, I think it was 1 Timothy 6. Back in chapter 5, where we were be content with things as we have. All right, what do we get to? Verse 9. Verse 9 has the second proverb in these first three verses. It's better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of desire. This verse seems to indicate that there is more gratification and happiness in being content with what we have directly before us than to yearn for that which we do not have. These two proverbs can relate equally well to the desire for riches or for knowledge. Both are important in their place, but neither is the key to life. So the question, I guess this was my question. This is not his question. So when does desire for something become a problem or a sin? When does desire? I mean, I see things all the time that I would like to have, or that I desire. Is that wrong? When it consumes me, at what point would I know when it consumes me? All right. So if I spend all my time thinking about it to the point that maybe I'm neglecting other responsibilities or other obligations, I think that's definitely could be a problem. Any other thoughts? I wanted to read James chapter 1, verses 14 through 15. It tells us that each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. So we have this progression here that James presents to us. And I mentioned already that there's a lot of these teachings that we get out of Ecclesiastes that goes hand in hand with a lot of the teachings from the book of James in the New Testament. But he tells us that those desires and lusts come from within. And when it is conceived, now of course conception is when something just begins to grow, right? As soon as it starts to grow in your desires and your thoughts and in your mind, I guess, especially when it matures and it brings forth sin. I don't know what time we're going to today. I think it was about 5 after when we started. So I'm going to try to move on just a little bit further anyway. I don't know if I'll get through chapter 6. It depends on how late y'all want to hang around. Nobody's coming through the doors yet. Verse 10 tells us in this verse there's different translations, and the Revised Standard Version seems to capture the better wording. The main point of this passage here is that the fundamental truths of life are well known and there is nothing to be added. It is known that he is man could also be translated, it is known what man is. Verse 11, or also in verse 10, it tells us that man cannot contend with God. Verses 10 and 11 taken together kind of remind us that we cannot alter the way in which we or our world were made. These things are already named and known. This is another way of saying with the rest of Scripture that they owe their being to the command of God. This command includes the sentence passed upon us at Adam's fall. We naturally find it hard and want to protest. Job kind of protested, if you read through the book of Job, but eventually he abandoned that protesting after much heart searching. Isaiah 45 and verse 9 reminds us that the clay has no right to question the potter, just as we have no right to question God, for He truly is the potter and we truly are the clay. Verse 11 tells us that many things increase vanity. The fourth unanswered question asked here is, how is man the better? Who knows what is good for man in life? In verse 12, the fifth question asked, undoubtedly our Creator is the only one who really knows what is best for us. He's the potter and we're the clay. All the days of His vain life which He passes like a shadow. Our vain lives are compared to being a shadow in a number of passages. I am going to read real quick that Psalm 39. I thought about looking at a few of these, but if I needed some more time, but I'm not hurting for material, I guess, to take up time. But this is Psalm 39, 4 through 6. It says, Lord, make me to know my end and what is the measure of my days, that I may know how frail I am. Indeed, you have made my days as handbreadths. I guess a handbreadth is kind of like from your pinky to the thumb. And my age is as nothing before you. Certainly every man is at his best state, but vapor. Surely every man walks about like a shadow. Surely they busy themselves in vain. He heaps up riches, and he does not know who will gather them. And then the last point, and from verse 12, I guess the sixth unanswered question, who can tell man what will happen after him? Our understanding is limited, as is shown by our inability to predict the future. What will become of us? Who knows? Part of it, that we shall not die, we all know too well. And for the rest of it, we know all too little. These last two questions are a double bewilderment. Man who lives his life apart from God is left with neither any absolute values for which to live, what is good, nor any practical certainties for which to plan for what will be. So we'll stop there. I will hit the lessons from chapter 6 next week. Thanks for your attendance today and being here. Hope you have a good week. And we'll pick up there next week.